Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Openly Live, Balancing Privacy, Ethics and Law. Now, today is obviously a very special day for those in the privacy field. Data Privacy Day, which is celebrated on the 28th of January each year, gives us the opportunity to stop and review how we handle personal information, as well as discussing how we can do more to protect our customers, clients, staff and businesses. Today also marks the first iteration of the Openly Live series. So before we kick off, I thought it would be good to just take a moment to introduce Openly and get through all the boring stuff nice and upfront. So Openly is a privacy tech company based here in Adelaide. We offer privacy certification for small businesses of all sizes, delivering assurance of compliance with Australian privacy laws. Now, Openly has also developed its own privacy code, which extends upon the Privacy Act, offering additional protection for consumers. This privacy code goes into public consultation over the next couple of weeks, but it is a significant step because it means that Openly will be the first independent organisation to develop an industry-wide privacy code. This legally binding but voluntary code focuses on the better privacy governance, better protection for children, more transparency for overseas disclosure, and less unexpected use of personal information. Now, the Openly system works on a theory of ethics. We ask organisations to take a step above law and do more to protect their customers' privacy. This obviously ties in nicely with the theme of today's webinar, where we will dissect the interconnection between privacy law and ethics. Now, to do this, we've gathered the best in the business to discuss their thoughts, forecasts and concerns regarding the state of privacy in Australia. So with that, it is time to introduce our panel of speakers and get this webinar underway. So first off, we would like to offer a warm welcome to Tim de Sousa. Now, Tim currently works as the Senior Director of Technology at FTI Consulting and is also an IAPP ANZ Advisory Board member. Try saying that 10 times. He has previously held roles at the CommBank, Westpac, 11M and the OIC, and has obviously gathered a lot of experience in the privacy sphere, and at the same time has built a strong reputation in the market. Thank you for joining us, Tim.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Hi, everyone.
No worries. You're the first one. You're buying the beers. Talking on mute. Now, next we'd like to say hello to Marion Hemphill. So Marion currently works as the General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer at Australian Red Cross Lifeblood. Marion's experience within both the corporate and health sectors as a General Counsel obviously provides a unique view into privacy in the context of health. Thank you for joining us as well, Marion.
Good morning. Good to be here.
And last but by no means least, we would like to welcome Phil Green. Now, Phil is the Privacy Commissioner for the Office of the Information Commissioner in Queensland. He's worked across both private and public sectors and says his passion is for economic development, small business, innovation and human rights. And obviously, Phil's government experience provides deep insight into the influences of law and government in the privacy context. So welcome to you, Phil.
Thank you. Great to be here on Data Privacy Day too.
Yeah, fantastic day. It's exciting for us, at least. Now, we'd like to kick off the webinar perhaps by speaking with Marion from the Australian Red Cross first. Within the OIC's Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme quarterly, the health sector accounted for 22% of notifiable data breaches between January to June 2020. And this follows a similar trend by which the health sector has hit the top of the list on multiple occasions. Now, this is obviously particularly concerning given the nature of personal information collected by healthcare professionals and the community expectation for privacy when it does come to health data. So Marion, I guess the question I'd like to put to you is the health services industry as a whole doing enough to protect the personal information of individuals, and can more be done?
Well, I think the data clearly says that they're not doing enough. It's really distressing to see the health sector represented that way on the notifiable breaches list. And a lot of it does seem to be down to human error. And, you know, given that the data that they hold is so valuable and it's needed for health outcomes, it's not just valuable to someone trying to attack it for nefarious purposes, but it's actually really important to the patients and the consumers of the health sector trust the health sector itself, because if we don't get that information in, we won't be able to get the health outcomes for individuals or more broadly in the in the genomics field and in the research field. In terms of, I think it's clear they're not doing enough. And in terms of why, it's a little bit hard to say, but my experience is that there's not enough bandwidth and resourcing within the health sector. Health's got a lot to focus on. It's a really broad industry, and there's experts who are appointed to just really focus on patient outcomes, and a lot of the times they're being asked to do additional things to do with privacy. So I think that, to do more, I think the health sector really needs to bring in privacy and data protection as a underlying hygiene feature, the way that they focus on patient consent and safety and finances. And for those things, you bring in experts. You don't rely on your doctors and your medical practitioners to do it. You have to bring people in. It's a bit tricky in the health sector because, like a lot of sectors, it's strapped for cash. And if you've got a choice between getting in a heart specialist or getting in a neonatal specialist or bringing in an enormous machine for treating cancer patients, it can be quite hard to justify spending money on bringing in someone who's not a medical specialist but who's a data privacy specialist. I think there really needs to be a shift in perception in the health sector around the value of data. It's just as valuable as a lot of other resources that they've got, so they've got to put some money behind it. And I think they also need to focus on transparency. I'm sure we'll be talking a bit about transparency today, and Jay, you've already mentioned it in terms of the Openly's code. So it's really good to see that focus. But I think that the medical health sector puts a lot of focus on transparency in terms of consent and putting things in plain English, and they need to do the same thing with privacy. It's not a matter of putting it in the fine print. It's a matter of explaining to people why their information is essential, what they're going to do with what the health sector is going to do with it, and importantly, who they're going to share it with. I think if we have a bit more faith in consumers, they'll probably be a bit happier. If they know how their information is being protected, but also how it's being shared, they'll be happy to consent to that, because that's going to contribute to their own health outcomes, but for society more broadly. And people are, altruistic. They do like to help other people, provided that's not going to adversely impact them. And it tends to be the loss of trust that's the problem, rather than a lack of wanting to share information.
Yeah, look, I think you certainly raised a couple of really interesting points there, Marion, and particularly, I guess, a great example of what you're speaking about there was the implementation of the My Health record, where we saw, I guess, a bit of backwards and forwards between what the consumer was expecting and potentially what the government messaging was around that app and the transparency measures. I think we got to a point in the end where it did achieve what it was required to achieve, and it was actually rolled out quite nicely. But I guess when you've got that negative press around the health sector in particular, and I guess broadly the health sector, it does, I guess, pull into question the consumer's willingness to trust, I guess, these organisations.
Yeah, and then the bad stories get a little bit more leverage than the good stories. I mean, if you think about the Health Engine example from, I can't remember, the year before it was, and I think if Health Engine, in people making appointments, had said to people, oh, by the way, if your injury looks like it's an accident and there might be some legal issues, we're going to would you like us to pass your information on just to a lawyer who can help you? I think a lot of people would have said yes. But instead, it was a very fine print and very woolly down at the bottom. And so people felt that their information had been shared when they weren't expecting it. And that gets a lot more mileage than a good news story.
Yeah, you're right, totally right. And I think it probably does raise a really important point about transparency, and I guess something that I spoke about a little bit earlier around the reduction of unexpected use of personal information. And we know that when it comes to privacy, obviously there is that inherent pull between ethics and law. And when it comes to the health sector, as you've mentioned, obviously ethics becomes even more important, given the personal information is often quite sensitive, can relate to vulnerable members of the public as well. So personally, we've engaged with several health service providers, and they've all expressed their willingness to step over and above the law. But a lot of what you mentioned earlier around lack of time, lack of skills, I think the nature of the health profession is quite rapid in everything that it does. So trying to slow things down and account for privacy is difficult. So I guess from your point of view, over the next, say, 5 years, do you believe ethics will play a bigger role with organisations taking more initiative to go beyond legal requirements, or conversely, are we going to see more data breaches and I guess more issues coming out of all industries rather than just health?
I think, unfortunately, I don't think it's an either or. I think we might see both because it's a bit of a moving target. I'm genuinely optimistic about the role of ethics in business, but I think we've got a long way to go. I don't think there's actually inherently a pull between ethics and law. I think that they're on the same path, but the difficulty is there's a perception that they're two different things. But reports like APRA's report on the Commonwealth and the Royal Commission report into the financial sector a couple of years ago have been really useful for all businesses beyond the financial sector, because it's talking about that focus isn't just on the low bar of compliance, but actually we need to aim a lot higher. Compliance is your starting point, but you should be aiming to clear the bar comfortably, not just skim over it. So the question should be, as a business, not what we can get away with, but what should we be doing? And I don't think that's necessarily inconsistent with things like wanting a minimum viable product, because for economic reasons. Because I think that doing the right thing isn't necessarily bad for your business. Social media companies, I think, have set a really unfortunate tone and a pattern of almost trying to trick people into giving their personal information and giving as little information about the security as not popping it into the fine print. But there's actually no reason why they couldn't be more transparent and trust consumers a little bit more. Facebook could have said to its consumers, yes, this is a free service, and we're going to let you share some photos and show off your holidays. But in return, we're going to take information about you and we're going to on-sell that to third parties. And also, we're going to use the information that we gather about you to send you some ads, products that we think you like, based on what other things that you've commented on and what you've liked. I think that people took that transparent approach, that ethical approach. It can actually be seen as something that's good for your business. The real thing that worries me is that I don't think that ethics is treated within business as something that's part of business hygiene. It's not treated like good finances, focusing on a good compliance program and focusing on a good safety program, but it should be. It should be in the pillars there. A lot of businesses don't have an ethics specialist. Lawyers are often seen as being the moral compass of an organisation and to bring up the ethical issues, and yet the pressure on the lawyer is to tell you the bottom line and what your compliance is. So I think that's a long way to go, but the more we see commentary and good governance focusing on messages from APRA and the Royal Commission and other sectors, and the more we see good privacy practices rewarded by the market and bad privacy practices punished by both regulators and the market, I think that will help the end. But we are dealing with a climate where breaches are quite constant. Human error is always going to be an issue, because that's humans are always going to be involved in these processes, and we're also always going to have nefarious characters who are one step ahead of the game and looking to extract information. So I think we need to focus on the ethics and keep reminding ourselves what we should be doing, and clearing the bar of minimum compliance, because that should keep us on the right track.
Yeah, and I think it's a really, I guess, an interesting thing to talk about, quantifying ethics, particularly at a board level. It's hard to show, I guess, value driven from ethical behaviour when you can see the quick win so clearly in front of you by potentially not acting as ethically, which I think is something we've probably seen out of Facebook and the likes. I don't want to bash Facebook the whole time, but it's the easy example that comes to mind. That was a business decision potentially not made with ethics front of mind. And, whether I don't think many people would agree that it was a malicious act. I think it was more careless. But I guess it is getting that commitment from board level that you can actually go ahead and make decisions that in the short term might cost you a little bit more money, but in the long term is going to drive greater customer loyalty and potentially, I guess, more willingness to share data.
Yeah, and I think people have to keep, it's not a one-stop question. You don't ask yourselves, for Facebook, I mean, I have no idea whether Facebook's founders thought that it was going to be so large. So when they were starting out, they were making decisions for that business then, and that's all that anybody can do. I think part of good corporate governance is coming back again and again and retesting your assumptions, and having another look at your operations and re-asking yourselves those questions, because something that was acceptable 5 years ago may not be acceptable today.
Yeah, absolutely right. Now, that probably is a good segue to bring Tim from FTI Consulting into the conversation. Now, Tim, as you would be aware, obviously, and as Marion touched on as well, health isn't the only industry impacted heavily by privacy concerns. We've seen multiple stories over the past 18 to 24 months of continuous privacy breaches from multiple industries and alarming uses of personal information, particularly from the tech sector. We saw in the early days of Facebook, as Marion alluded to, the adoption of their mantra, move fast and break things. And back 5 years ago, that was sort of lauded as an innovative step that encouraged rapid product development and innovative thinking. But by their own admission, the privacy issues that have arisen out of Facebook by and large have been driven by that mantra. And it became clear in the aftermath of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for example, that privacy wasn't heavily considered when developing tools and services for their users. Now, while we zero in on Facebook with this example and perhaps the previous one as well, they are certainly not the only organisation that experienced the wrath of its users due to privacy missteps and a lack of transparency or perceived transparency. Now, marketers and tech players all over the world are battling with what's right according to the law versus what's right according to ethics. And we know in simple terms that trust delivers sales. Where customers are concerned about privacy, they tend to turn away. And the OIC Community Attitudes to Privacy survey conducted last year showed that 88% of respondents said they had chosen not to deal with an organisation because of privacy concerns. That's a staggering number. So my question for you is, do organisations need to adopt a more transparent method of operation? And if so, I guess, what does that model look like?
Yeah, look, I would say that everybody needs to adopt a more transparent approach to how they deliver services. And as we start adopting more and more technologies around AI, machine learning, automated processes, and in particular automated decision making, if we don't start adopting more transparent processes, we're going to be in serious trouble, because we're going to be in a scenario where decisions are delivered and the customer feels that those decisions are wrong, and the organization delivering those decisions is not in a position to explain why. We'll be in a situation where we go, oh, well, computer says no, therefore we're right and you're wrong. And that is an extremely dissatisfactory outcome for a user or a customer, and it's going to be problematic from a defensibility position for the organization. So this is where we start getting into considerations of privacy by design and how we take that philosophy and apply it to implementing new and emerging technologies like AI and machine learning. So in terms of how do we build trust as we bring in these new technologies, we're thinking about things like, well, let's create some minimum standards for automated decisions. So make them transparent, make them traceable, make them accountable, and make them appellable. So that, okay, here is how we make the decision. We use this decision-making process. It's this algorithm. You can interrogate it and see if it is fit for purpose. The decision must be traceable. So here is your decision. Here are the rules that we applied to your decision. Here is the evidence that we applied those rules to. So if there's a flaw in any step of that process, you can identify it and then you can make your appeal. Accountability is very important, because a decision should be a decision of your organization, whether or not it is made by a person or it is made by a system. So you have to stand by that. If you've automated a decision, you have to stand by that decision. You have to be accountable for it. And finally, at the end of all that, it's still possible that your decision is wrong. Just because a computer is involved doesn't mean that some magic process came in and made everything perfect. Computers are built by people. They are programmed by people. There is always going to be an opportunity for a mistake or a flaw to make its way in. So ultimately, every automated decision is going to have to be appellable. And if you've made it transparent and traceable, then appealing an incorrect decision should be very easy, because it'll be much easier for the user and much easier for the organization to find where the flaw entered the decision-making process. So that is those kinds of considerations are being put in place by a lot of governments right now, especially governments who are working on machine consumable legislation and machine consumable rule sets. But I think that private enterprise needs to be taking that approach as well, because we know that automation is coming. We know that it's being increasingly implemented. So we need to put in place a methodology to make sure that we're going to produce better results for users and not just cheaper results for the organizations implementing this tech. It turns out that we can have both. We can have both cheaper service delivery and better service delivery. But we need to put in that privacy by design ethos from the beginning and that ethics by design ethos throughout the process. It needs to be the connective tissue between the different elements of the way that we do business.
So Tim, just to pick up on something that you mentioned there around governments in particular looking at rules for emerging technologies, it probably leads nicely into the next question for you, which is how much of a role should government play in privacy regulation? We know that it is quite a complex field. We also know that it's pretty hard to mandate ethics from a business. So should the ethics responsibility lie solely with the organisation, and should we see more regulation from governments, or is it something you think can be managed directly out of the organisation itself?
I don't think it's a matter of either or. I mean, in terms of how much, it's an interesting question, because how much of a role should government play in regulating ethics? Well, if government doesn't play a role, then there's no regulation at all. So you have to draw a line between, the ghost of Adam Smith busting through the wall and going, well, the market will decide. And considering, well, if there's actually widespread problematic practice throughout an industry sector or throughout the society, which I think in terms of technology, we are seeing some difficulties there. You have to say, well, maybe there is a role for government to step in and actually provide some pressure to evolve better practices across the sector. Organizations are in many ways like living organisms. They go towards attractive things. Oh, that smells nice, an emerging market, that smells tasty, let's go there. And they recoil and protect themselves from adverse stimuli, like the potential of fines. So it is clear that that regulation is another tool in the toolbox to help industry evolve better practices. Because if there are big fines for undesirable activities, that then companies will move away from that. That's part of why compliance is one of the fastest growing employment sectors at the moment. In Australia, well over 1 million people are involved in compliance and risk and governance roles. So that is definitely an option. It's a tool within the toolkit. The difficulty for governments is to not go too far, to create too much of a burden on industry and thereby crush innovation, reduce profitability. There is a very fine line that has to be walked.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I'd like to bring Phil into this conversation, obviously on that topic of the role of government, which is obviously quite complex. So while we just bring Phil in, I'd also like to take the opportunity to just welcome questions from our audience across whatever platform they're watching on. If you have any specific questions that you'd like the panel to address, feel free to leave a comment across either YouTube, Facebook or Twitter. They are coming through to us, so we'll do our best to answer some of those at the end of the webinar. Now, we know that privacy compliance is quite a complex task for any organisation. And as we mentioned, and as Tim alluded to, the role of government is also equally complex. With the introduction of the sea of acronyms, with our friends over in Europe adopting the GDPR, the CCPA in California, and now the LGPD in Brazil, we're also seeing further iterations of privacy reform in the works here in Australia, including our Privacy Act review. It looks like the role of government appears to be changing, particularly when it comes to ensuring that privacy legislation meets consumer expectations. It does leave quite a compliance minefield for a multinational organisation that's working across many regions. Obviously, the obligations across each region, even in the most updated laws, obviously differ quite significantly. So for Phil, I guess the question for you is, what does the privacy landscape look like in 5 years? Is it more fragmented, or do we see a more unified approach where everyone sort of comes to the same standard in utopia?
Well, for sure. The role of a privacy officer in an organization like Microsoft that trades across, globally, and even some of these social media platforms don't have good penetration in places like Russia or China, but it's certainly complex. I see in the next 5 years, as we've seen in the last 5 years, some convergence and some common ground. So Europe, enacted more or less the GDPR. They might have tweaked a couple of matters, but I think there's no doubt they'll be adequate. And the basic concepts there, like notifiable data breach schemes, they've just been introduced in New Zealand. Australia was leading the charge. Canada's in there. The US has had those regimes in some states. And I think globally, there's more and more countries. I just saw a map of Africa that Graham Greenleaf's put out, I think, showing, the adoption there. There's pressure because if companies trade globally, they're expected to lift their game in those areas or they'll lose customers. And probably the best example to recently, and Facebook has a serious oversight board of ethics, and I've heard their legal counsel speak about their ethical processes. I don't think they're totally adequate, but they're certainly important because they show the leadership and that you've got to always be on your game there where there's gaps between the law. So I think the law will be pushing forward. We're really in catch up. I'm hoping Australia will become more unified. I know WA is talking seriously about enacting legislation, and we're in need of reform in Queensland to catch up, but I'm advocating consistency with the Australian privacy principles and laws. That's currently under review too, so it's a moving target for us to keep up with. But I do see the pressure, particularly global companies, governments that trade, in, and you're a captive customer of them, obviously aren't under as much pressure. But I think, when you're exposed to national regimes that don't treat privacy or human rights adequately, those pressures come to bear on government as well. But certainly global companies, and making it easier. I'm all for one for reducing red tape and trying to make consistent laws. I think Australia's mandatory data breach is a bit more generous in terms of the times for notification. Even that has caused problems where companies are notifying in the UK or in Europe because they're jumping the gun without necessarily the information. So it shows there is definitely a need for us to become more consistent, and there's a need for us to keep up because techs, as Tim pointed out, there's great gaps there. And I think the use of AI and this decision making, it brings in far beyond the privacy, the ethical principles involved in human rights and transparency for accountable decision making, and just say administrative law go far beyond privacy. Privacy is an important piece. And I think the other danger there is, and I know Data 61 was criticized for this in their piece on AI because they kind of ignored some of the existing legal frameworks, and often those can be adapted or transformed a bit. There's a risk of ethics washing, as we've seen is sort of in the green space of environmental washing. People are talking about ethics or privacy washing, where they wave a magical ethics committee past or above something, and then it's given the all clear. That might not necessarily work. I think Marion there talked about the bare compliance model. One of the most recent examples shows how the market will punish that was WhatsApp and Facebook, where they were doing all the right things in terms of legal notices and consents, but when people actually worked out what they were saying, they all jumped to Signal and to Telegraph. Apparently, the growth in those two apps was enormous. So it shows how even if you're behaving what you think is ethically or legally, the market can still punish you severely.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. a little off topic, but one of my favourite stories out of the WhatsApp and Telegram debate was seeing the share price for Telegram Industries absolutely skyrocket before investors worked out that actually Telegram is a privately traded company and they've just invested in the completely wrong platform. So that goes to show the power of that sway, and you start to see influential figures in debates like that, particularly, for example, Elon Musk has been quite vocal around the switch to Telegram. Now, you also mentioned there the Facebook Oversight Board, which I think is a really interesting one. It's an interesting debate around the structure of it. Obviously, the board comes out of Facebook, so it is still going to be inherently biased towards, I guess, the decisions of Facebook. But what are your thoughts on its current way of operation around, I guess, reviewing content takedown versus what's actually being kept up on the platform? That's kind of the battle that they're in at the moment.
Yeah, well, there's been a bit of chatter, I think, because it hasn't made identifiable decisions in the last couple of years, and everyone's looking at what that board will do with Trump and his content, and then how that'll be judged against things that they haven't taken down in the past. So it's almost a watch this space. I don't know that it's an ultimately good idea to have it drawn, largely from internal sources. But you could have the Pope on there. You could have who knows, and ultimately it may become a bit captured or swayed by how they do business. Basically, it's quite difficult, I think, to judge in terms of fast-paced technology, where your business will evolve to. And so perhaps those ethics bodies, they might be able to wave that ethics lens over them, but the business development process, I think, is very tricky as well in those companies, because one day you can be chopped liver. So that rapid, huge innovation, that hit Kodak, say, for example, that could easily hit a platform. So it is difficult, I think, to have the business steered commercially by somebody who's not familiar with the business.
Yeah, it's true. It's a difficult balance, isn't it? Now, I just wanted to touch on a comment you made also around, I guess, the flexibility of the Australian framework, particularly, for example, with the notifiable data breaches scheme versus the mandatory reporting in the EU. I guess that leads nicely into a comment around the fact that Australian mandate for privacy has largely been the encouragement of self-regulation. Our Privacy Act, as an example, is designed to provide latitude for organisations to demonstrate compliance, and compared to something like GDPR, it is quite a bit less onerous on organisations. Now, I probably want to ask the same question put to Tim earlier, which is that while it's widely accepted that it's nearly impossible for a government to mandate ethics, how much of a role should government play, firstly, in privacy regulation, and then secondly, I guess, where does the ethics responsibility lie within the organisation, or is it with some help from government?
Was that question to me?
To Phil. Sorry, I think we've chucked the wrong person up on the screen there. We'll just do a quick little switch. There we go.
Yeah, I think that government still has to have a strong regulatory role. What we've seen is we've rapidly enhanced the powers of the Australian regulator, possibly not their resources as much as should be, but there've been a heap of extra responsibilities placed on that office. At a state level, we haven't seen the powers increase necessarily as much. I think there's pressure on states to have a stronger role in the regulatory environment for governments. And our big gap is small business exemption, amongst some other exemptions. But that's possibly why Australia won't even get adequacy under GDPR, that we actually don't have enough teeth. The fines are probably matching now, and some of the powers that Angeline has are certainly up there in scale, but there's still some gaps, and particularly small business. I think small business right now, the opting in approach or the actually adoption of good privacy practices is one where there is a certain need for businesses to step up ethically. I think that education on that is, hey, if you're a startup, an aspiring startup, you'll hopefully be over $3 million turnover one day. So get ready now and start putting in good practices now before you ruin your reputation is probably a good approach for small business. I still think that, yeah, the ethics point is it's particularly valuable where the law hasn't kept up and as a guiding compass for businesses or for government. And the earlier example of health, actually, the notifications in health being high, I would hazard a guess that it's because health's particularly conscientious where they have lost data or people have been compromised. They're actually good at reporting. And health practitioners tend to have fairly good ethics principles. That's often what's drawn them into that profession. So I suspect that there's a bit more zealous reporting in health. I think the human error factor still exists, and that's a number of the breaches we see. But behaving ethically after the event is important too. And Red Cross I still use as an example of probably the best data breach response in Australian history so far, anyway, in terms of a response for the breach that hit a few years back. And I think there was great care taken, and certainly brand didn't seem to suffer in the end. But health practitioners generally give me less strife, and particularly in the AI space, the doctors have very much been transparent about use of artificial intelligence and keeping human oversight of the decision-making processes. So again, they're the ones who make the final decisions. They're not going to have a computer tell them what to do necessarily. They talk more in terms of augmented intelligence rather than artificial.
Yeah, look, you've raised some really interesting points there, and I think particularly the point on ethics not needing to end when things go wrong, that you can behave ethically after the fact, which is actually a really, I guess, poignant point in itself. And we have seen a couple of companies get absolutely whacked for either slow responses or perhaps not caring as much as what the consumer is expecting them to do. You bring up the Red Cross example, and totally agree. I think it was handled brilliantly and incredibly transparently in the market. And, the outcome for a company that does handle it well, we see that consumers are quite forgiving in general. Now, that's not to say, obviously, we want to see data breaches every day of the week, but we will see that where it is well managed, that you'll see less of a drop off in customers, you'll see less of a drop off in trust, and those actions do actually build trust over the long term. So yeah, it is a really interesting conversation to get into. Now, I did want to throw an open question out to the panel now, and then we might just jump through a couple of questions that have come in from some viewers. So I guess from the panel, and we might start with you, Tim.
Sure.
We have seen over throughout the Community Attitudes to Privacy survey that there was a pretty interesting statistic that arose from a younger audience segment. So we saw that 43% of people aged 18 to 34 have never heard of the Privacy Act, and 62% of people 18 to 34 aren't aware of the Privacy Commissioner. Now that leaves a pretty interesting gap for arguably the audience that is the most tech-driven and the most adoptive of new tech. How can organisations better engage with younger audiences and ensure that perhaps ethics takes over in cases where these younger audiences may be more blasé about privacy?
The kind of the adage that young people don't care about privacy is one that I've heard a lot through my career, and one that I don't really disagree with. I think in part it's because so yes, perhaps younger generations aren't as aware of the regulatory systems and bodies that we put in place to regulate privacy. And I would say outside of, the cadre of law students, that would probably go for a lot of people. I don't think that's necessarily a problem, because when systems work well, you are not going to be aware of them. They're the kinds of things that are raised to your attention when things go wrong. In terms of how do we reach out to young people? Well, let's begin with making our communications more accessible to young people. We talk a lot about plain English, but we don't necessarily talk a lot about why plain English is so important. 28% of the Australian population has been to university. Up to 1/3 of the Australian population has low literacy levels, to the point that they can struggle to get through day-to-day tasks. So when we put out privacy policies that are 4,000 words long and require postgraduate education to understand, we're basically locking out huge chunks of our user base to understanding what we're doing. We need to move beyond this idea of this privacy policy being this beautiful liability shield that will protect us from the ravages of the regulators, to how do we communicate with our customers in a meaningful way? Can we provide just-in-time notifications? Can we provide short, pithy statements? Can we give people the information that they are interested in at the time that they need it and where it will be useful to them? If we start taking this approach, then we are educating our customer base as to how we're using their information, and we're building their expectations about what they can expect us to do. This is how we avoid surprises and preserve trust. We should be aiming to ensure that our customers are never surprised by what we're doing, that we're telling them what we're going to do and that they understand it. Quite often, and it's partially because a lot of organizations focus on the minimum compliance requirements, what we do is throw a huge amount of information at people in a way that we have every expectation that they will ignore. One of the other things about the Community Attitudes to Privacy survey is that year on year, it consistently finds that most people don't read privacy policies, because we don't write privacy policies that people are able to read. So part of reaching out to young people is presenting information in a way that they are able to digest, in formats that they're able to digest.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. And I think that is an interesting debate in itself around the privacy policy. And, it's the classic example of ticking off legal compliance to say you have your 10,000 word essay written in legalese that no one can decrypt, not even the smartest of AI. So it's a really interesting point you've raised. Marion, I wanted to actually mould that question a little bit more to the health sector. And ask how we can better engage with vulnerable audiences. Obviously, we see that it is hard, particularly in the health sector, and I guess drilling down more into the research sector, where you're dealing with audiences that might be cognitively impaired or potentially suffering from illness that I guess makes it difficult for them to make good privacy decisions, or not necessarily good, but any privacy decisions for themselves. How do you see the health sector working to counter that?
I think that Tim made a really good point about no surprises and meeting expectations, because in the health sector in particular, people are if they're seeking assistance, they might be in pain or they might have some worries. So they're sort of under duress. And then, they've got a lot of things to think about in terms of consenting to a medical procedure and what their treatment's going to involve. And they're in a noisy hospital sometimes. So it's really difficult for them to focus on a privacy statement when there's so much in front of it. People don't look at privacy statements on a good day, so they're not going to look at it on a really bad day. So I think it's really up to the health sector and all sectors to not have no surprises, meet expectations. What do people think you would do with information, and what do people think you would put in place to protect their information, and meet those standards rather than trying to do something that's unexpected in some way. And I do think the health sector could possibly learn a bit from the airline industry. They're having a tough year at the moment, but if you look at airline videos and safety standards, it's really important for people to turn their phone off, put their seatbelt on, and know where the exits are. They're not being given a dense piece of paper and asked to read things. There's a video. And they used to be quite boring, but now airlines are trying to, like if you look at Air New Zealand in particular, they put the All Blacks in one. They had one where people were body painted. So it sort of caught people's interest and imagination and gave them the information they needed in a really easy, digestible way, really visual way. And I think there's scope for the health sector to learn a bit more from that. Something doesn't have to be dense to be effective. And we call things policies, and even the word policy is dull and people don't want to read it. It could be, what do you need to know? What you should know now, what we're asking you. Lots of Q&As, things that are easily digestible, lots of pictures, and really, I'd also think doing research around who your audience is and what is going to work with them. I think there's a lot of space for R&D to see how much people are picking up and where people have time to pick things up. And there's a lot more ability to perhaps utilise a bit more technology and multimedia communication so that people can understand what they're consenting to. But at the end of the day, I couldn't agree more with what Tim said about no surprises.
Yeah. I mean, if I could jump back in there for a moment, the other thing that we really need to move away from is this kind of one-size-fits-all approach. You can't, especially when you're a large organization or you've got a large user base, you can't take your user base as a monolith. There are going to be different needs within that group. So you can't just put up a single privacy policy and go, oh, well, this is going to be fine for everybody. You need to think about the different kinds of users that you have and work to that. So maybe you have your big liability shield, because frankly, I can't see legal advisors allowing those to go anywhere. But you can also have your 2-minute video or your easy English version or your translation into other languages.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and accessibility is a challenge, I think, for a lot of organisations. And it probably goes a little bit back to what Phil mentioned earlier around that small business issue, and I guess trying to make privacy policies more engaging when you're a cash-strapped startup is a difficult sort of conversation. We start going into videos. It's easy for a Google to go out and produce 100 different videos explaining each aspect potentially transparently versus a small business and I guess how they build out a privacy policy for themselves. Phil, from your perspective, what are your thoughts on that, I guess, with the government lens?
We had a few years back the Li Lin Chin privacy notice for SBS broadcast for the Pacific Privacy Authority people, and the use of humour and those sort of communications, I think, tools is really important. I think banding around right now is some symbols or trusted symbols where you can kind of get a signature or a trademark, which might give you some assurance that there may be a place for those. What I guess the community attitudes survey shows me, I guess, is there a lot of work for us in privacy, data security, and safety. The E-Safety Commissioner for Children's Safety, particularly, I think, is another area where building that into the design and the mentality of new products is really important. And so there's lots of work to be done. We've tried to reach the schools, and I myself am guilty. When you take a new update of an operating system from Apple, you don't read the terms and conditions. They're too long, and otherwise you're just going to brick your phone or create security flaws. So you're almost quietly resolved, and I think that is a problem. I do think there's a place, and you're seeing this probably in privacy regulators, convergence of consumer and competition law. So Australia's ACCC sniffing around the tech companies. I think where they have market power and ability to force people to do things, or take it or leave it, and there's big consumer impacts, that's actually an area of law where you need some strong teeth regulation. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. But there's no question the US has been thinking about that, because the FTC is their regulator in privacy. And I do see that there'll be some more stops of perhaps mergers or forcing third products and things like that, and that the consumer regulator will have a place for people who try and hide in the fine print or force consents. I think we need to join forces in that area as well, to avoid, it's possibly legal conduct, but it's pushing the realms of other unconscionable sort of conduct.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I have a viewer question here, which I think might be for you, Tim. going back to your comment on particularly like deep learning and machine learning decision making. The question was, how can we be sure that a given model is not biased, particularly looking at deep learning, which is a black box even for the pros? That's come from Gabrielle over on YouTube.
Sure. I'm not going to pretend that this is a solved problem. However, two thoughts come to mind. Firstly, we need to do, if we're going to use machine learning and black box testing, black box systems, we need to do extensive testing. There needs to be extensive testing with a sufficiently diverse testing group to ensure that the system is not producing biased outcomes. That's onerous and it's difficult, but if we don't do it, we're going to get some pretty catastrophically bad results. The second thought I have is, actually, if you're using an AI system to make a decision and you can't explain it, then you shouldn't use it. We shouldn't use black box systems to make decisions, because how are we ever going to have any sense of comfort that the decision was correct? If it just goes in one end and comes out the other and in between is completely opaque, don't use it to make a decision. I recognize that as a rather strong position, but I think the dangers are too great at this point.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think Marion would agree with you, because I can imagine that sort of system in health potentially not working too kindly. Marion, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that AI is a tool. It doesn't replace human decision-making and human judgment. And they're designed by humans, so they're only as good as the human that designed them. So, and there's always a human interaction. So I think the trick is figuring out, you want a good human to be inputting into it and then making your final decision. I think, if you don't understand something, you shouldn't be using it. I think it's a really good rule. But there are, it's understanding that it complements and it might help justify decisions and point us in the right direction. But at the end of the day, we're always going to have to turn our mind to things and be able to justify and feel comfortable. If the little voice inside your head is telling you that something feels wrong, even though the computer said yes, you should listen to the voice in your head, because there is something behind it, and work it through.
And this is not to say that there is no role for deep learning or machine learning in any circumstance, just in the domain of decision making. Machine learning can be extremely useful in many other circumstances, but when we're talking about decision making, we need to be able to explain those.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we have a comment from a good friend of privacy in Australia here, Peter Leonard. Now Peter has commented that a lot of the ethical issues that arise out of entities is actually, in his view, that no one in authority and empowered actually cares what's ethical. Do you guys think, just I guess briefly, that there needs to be more empowerment at a higher level, or in your experience, do you think that the want to do right is there, but sometimes just potentially handicapped by circumstance? We might start with you, Marion.
I think it's a bit of both. I think, leadership is so important. And so it's really important for the leader of an organisation and the leadership team to be trained in ethics and to have open discussions and robust discussions and challenge each other without fear. But I think that everyone needs to be reminded, because we can all get blinkered. And so if you're trained in finance, or for me, you're trained in law, you can get blinkered and focus on a particular area, but you need everybody to come together to challenge your thinking from an ethical perspective. I think the more that you can build that into your regular practice and decision making, then that will help with ethical standards, because a lot of people do make assumptions that, oh, my boss won't like that, or that's going to cost us more money, therefore it's a no. Actually, it wouldn't be. It might be that someone has just got a blind spot and they haven't seen something in particular. So bad practices can continue on. I think that in the financial sector, when you look at the Royal Commission report and the Commonwealth report from APRA, it shows that sort of culture where people were focusing on one indicator, which was financial, rather than broader risk indicators. And it was not fear exactly, but a cautiousness of bringing up ethical issues further up, and an expectation that you'd be told no just because it didn't work on the bottom line. I think there needs to be more focus on open, robust discussion.
this is where we get into scenarios in which diversity becomes extremely important. Not just diversity of the makeup of the people in your team, but in terms of discipline and approach. So you want these decisions to be made by a multidisciplinary group and a group that is diverse socially as well, because those differences of experience, those differences of approach, and those differences of expertise are part of what helps you identify those blind spots. And that has to be integrated into your organization at every level from the board down.
Yeah, absolutely. Phil, what are your thoughts on that topic? Because I guess it's something that actually government does quite transparently and quite well, regardless of, I guess, the noise from the public. I think the government actually does do quite a good looking inwards and I guess being transparent in that approach. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's funny because Peter had made an earlier comment in the chat as well about setting sort of objectives, and unfortunately our law in Queensland doesn't have that mandatory impact assessment. So I think, yeah, when you say government's good at that sort of top leadership, I'm not sure. I think we could do better, and I think it's good, at the Commonwealth level, there's that impact assessment. So COVID Safe app, love it or leave it as a product or its outcomes, the privacy impact assessment and the public debate and transparency around that was one of probably the exemplar projects of government in Australia in the last couple of years, I'd say. There's been projects in Queensland using artificial intelligence where we open about privacy impact assessments, and I'm thinking of distracted drivers where New South Wales did a trial and Queensland's looking at trialling that technology, and I think we need to do better. So there's a desire, I believe, and I certainly have had that discussion with the Director General of Transport and Main Roads here about getting it out there and having the public debate and taking the public along so you get the social license to use that new tech. But I still think we have some examples where we haven't done it so well or not. And it is because, governments get focused on politics. They may not be focused on the bottom line or profit as much, but other outcomes possibly get in the way or create noise and tension. And I totally agree with Tim there about that need for diversity at all levels of the organisation and that openness of discussion and debate, because if it doesn't happen, then there's real risks that someone drops a ball.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I think we have hit the end of our time. It's definitely a discussion we could keep having for another hour, really. But I wanted to take this opportunity to thank our speakers. So Tim Sousa from FTI Consulting, Phil Green from the Office of the Information Commissioner Queensland, and Marion Hemphill from the Red Cross. Thank you very much for your time, guys, and enjoy the rest of your Data Privacy Day.
Will do.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.